I want to welcome you all to the Python Web Conference 2020. My name is Calvin Hendryx-Parker. I am CTO and co-founder of 6 Feet Up, and I'm going to be talking about finite state machines in Django. And if only a couple of those words make sense to you right away, I will hopefully demystify and clarify by the end of this talk what that's all about. Let's see if this all works. Yay, it's all hooked up. So who's this guy? My name's Calvin again. I am co-founder of 6 Feet Up. I'm also the co-founder of a couple meetups here locally, IndiePy and Indie AWS. My background goes back to starting with Zope and Plone back in the year 2000. If any of you all remember that, maybe some of you were around then, but I've been doing Python and Zope and Plone and now Django and lots of other awesome Python framework stuff since then. And I also helped write the training section on the workflow section for the Plone training and documentation. So there's a little bit of background there that'll help me describe to you how we can actually use finite state machines in Django and why that's actually important. So in case you're interested, our company 6 Feet Up is hiring. I thought I'd throw a little plug in there. We have an awesome group of people, and if you want to come be with more awesome groups of people like ourselves, feel free to hit me up or check out our website and look for the jobs. So before I kind of get into finite state machines, let's take a side into what are workflows. And workflows themselves are series of interactions to complete a task, which makes it really easy to understand because you start at A, you end at Z, and you may have 23 more steps in between, or 23 more steps along the way in between, but they're all over the place. And workflows can be formal or informal. There's not, some kinds of workflows, for example, you may have at your office, like requesting paid time off. You submit to your manager may review the schedule and then send back an approval saying, yes, that those days look great for you to take a vacation. Some workflows, maybe less formals, but basically, they are business rules, and business rules and computers are good at automating things. Business rules is a thing we can automate. And if we can help automate business rules and make all that smoothly flow, this is where we end up with the idea of state. So when I talk about finite state machine, in the workflow, we're going to have rules that we can describe as state. And if we ask the Wikipedia for what the definition of a finite state machine would be, it's a, automation, or simply a state machine, is a behavioral model used to design computer programs. So let's actually take this apart a little bit, thinking about composed of a finite number of states associated to transitions. And so that's where it's really important, is that these are all associated to specific kinds of transitions. States, you can think of them as, either, for example, if we're looking at publishing a document, and I'll get to a quick example about that. Publishing a document can be in the private state when starting, and then go to the published state afterward. And the arrows that lead between those two states are our transitions. And a transition is a set of actions that starts in one state and ends in another, or even the same state. And we'll see some examples of actually workflows where the transition ends you back in the same state as where you began. So the very beginning simple example of this is going to be a simple publication workflow. If you are familiar with Graphiz and the dot language, this is a snippet of dot basically used to describe a finite state machine using some text. So we've got a graph, which is from private to published, published to private, with labels on them, and those labels being the transitions that take you from one to the other. So you can see the simple workflow of private. Private has a transition that leads you to published, and then published has a transition that leads you back to private. And those transitions have names such as publish and retract. So here's like two states here, and you may be asking yourself, why couldn't I just use a checkbox or a Boolean field like published equal true or published equal false? And we'll talk about that in a moment. This talk has a lot of history rooted. Again, I mentioned Plone earlier on about writing the workflow training material for it. Plone released with a workflow tool, a finite state machine tool in it called DC Workflow. And it was so simple and so powerful that the idea really stuck with me. And I really wished that that idea existed in other frameworks. And luckily it does. So we're going to talk about how this works in Django later on, but we're going to have a solution for being able to do that. Now, the thing that's not shown in this simple example is the simple workflow is also currently not showing you who is allowed to do what, when, and where, which is another thing I really liked about the DC workflow tool that was built into Plone. So back to like state. If we're talking about private to published or something being processed, when is a field on an object such as state or workflow state ever truly a Boolean, whether it's on or off, like a published equal true or false? Well, it's really difficult to say because when it comes to state, you have lots of things going on behind the scenes, and rarely does the state ever stay just two specific states, like an on or an off. Typically, you may have other states in between, things like processed or processing or pending, sent, waiting, waiting for some kind of reply. This is where you want to be able to track extra conditions along the way, because you may have out of band or asynchronous processes that are actually working on your object in the background. And you don't want, for example, to have two workers pick up a piece of content out of your database, both of them do the same action on it, and then both put a result back, or attempt to put a result back, one clobbering the other. First of all, it's a waste of resources, and then you may end up with other strange race conditions. Whereas if you had the first worker pick it up, immediately change the state to processing, and then do its work, and then put the result back in, and then the state can be then processed. The other workers can now only look for items that maybe are in a pending state or in a new state or an initial state. So it helps keep things straight between all the various workers inside your project. Yeah, so example like that, the pattern being select all the things that haven't been processed, process them, but there's an in-between state here we're talking about, which is that processing state. Something else, can watch and track against that. So let's talk about an actual real life example. And I think, whoa. Sorry, slides got a little out of order there. Okay, here we go, sorry. Now, if we extend this to collaboration, I mean, using tools like this and being able to build software allows us to do a lot of things to help enable folks to actually collaborate. Maybe we want to have users want to share specific information online or through a process with only specific other users at specific points in time along the workflow. What's nice with the workflow tool and the system that's built into Plone is that the states themselves are also tied to sets of permissions or ACLs that can determine who can see the content. And when you combine that with a workflow that has multiple states, you now can determine who can see the content and when. So if something moves from one state to the other, it may grant access to a specific group of people or users inside your system to be able to see that. But let's actually look at a real life example. It's kind of hard to talk a bit abstractly without actually diving into a specific example. Let's talk about real life. Many of us have been students at a university. And so many of us may have gone through the process of trying to change our program or area of study that we would be wanting to move into. So for example, in my case, I started off at Purdue in the engineering school, and then I went over to the School of Technology because I shifted majors. That process, as you can imagine, at least in the United States and most probably universities, is not a simple one necessarily. This is a workflow diagram we actually developed for a specific customer to be able to actually automate that process of allowing a student to request a change in program, or maybe changing and adding different programs. So if you actually start off the process, you can see if we started at the top of this diagram, there's the in progress. So the initial state may have been just submitted, and then once you've submitted your request, it starts in the state of in progress. And you can see all the arrows that are going out, well, at least one arrow going out, which is submit, and then into pending review. And then you now have multiple flows with multiple people who are involved in this process. So for example, maybe the dean may have to accept something. If it's incomplete, it can be sent back into the student to do further processing. And then you can go in for example, if it's been completed, for example, that may be an automatic state, so that once the dean accepts it, it may land in a complete state, and that may trigger automatic transitions. So for example, auto selected, auto not selected, it may be based on content inside of that specific transition. And that can move it along until you get all the lines either lining up down to either accepted or rejected. And that in state of rejected means that you would have to start over fresh again because there's no arrows leading out of that state back into any other state that can be operated upon. So again, modeling a fairly complex process that has business rules in it about validation of whether the form is complete or not, whether a person is accepted or not, and whether it needs to be, before a deadline, miss a deadline. So you can have all kinds of considerations taken into place. So that's one example when it comes to student record information. What about researching cancer? If you're also tracking content coming into a system, I mean, this content can be about, just about anything you can imagine. You can apply this type of a process to. So if we looked at people submitting case reports into a collaboration portal, we actually helped build a collaboration tool for clinical researchers to research specific kinds of cancer, and they want to be able to submit anonymized case reports to be into a database where others can look them up, comment, and learn from other people's experiences. This one has an example of an item starting in a specific state. So there's a save state, which is equivalent of, I've just created a new case report for publication. It initially goes into that draft state. And as an end user, you'll see here I've got multiple colors in this specific diagram. The blue being the author. So anything that's in blue, the author has permissions to edit and view, obviously. The red being the editor, the administrative person handling the editing of the incoming requests. So the first state it goes into is draft. And you see there's a circle back from draft, right back into draft with the save transition. So as I mentioned before, the draft goes into the editor's queue. The same process can happen where you can track the saves and log those away. The editor can now send back, which puts it into the other author review state, allowing the author still the ability to edit and resubmit it for approval. The last bit we'll get to at the very bottom is once it's gone back to the editor and then published live, you'll see that there are two different colored arrows coming out of the live box. At the live state, maybe for example, the editor or the author can't actually change the content, so it's more of an immutable state. The blue arrow is controlled by the author, so the author has the permission to revise or say redact, retract the those labels are misspelled. It should be retracted by the author. Or if the editor wanted to do it, they also would have a separate revised transition protected by specific permissions. And I mentioned this before, that some workflows are automatic. A transition can be started by a specific trigger, and that trigger can be an event or a condition. And so we'll talk a little about that in a little bit. I'll show you how we do that in Django. So I've gone on for a bit here now, and I've not talked a little bit at all about Django. Django, as you all know, the web framework for perfectionists with deadlines, is a great place to actually build quick and easy to use applications where you may have form data that you need to save into a database. And so you can quickly create models, you can quickly create views, you can quickly put it up online. It's a great framework for getting things done quickly. But if you want to be able to model these workflows like I've just mentioned, it can be tricky to do that if you're only using the built-in fields of the Django framework itself. One of the things we need to be able to especially track is who can do what and when. With the Django models and permissions, you really don't have a way to say that an item in a specific state would have the ability for certain people to have certain actions over an item in another state having different sets of actions. This is a bit tricky. And also, if you wanted to be able to have an audit log of who did what, when, and where, and we'll talk about that later. One of the recommendations you'll find if you get into doing Django development is that it makes sense to do fat models. And by fat models, we encourage them, which is basically a technique of, building in additional functionality into your model itself. And so we're going to take that model and we're going to add in fields that track our state, but we'll also add in all the methods that would actually allow us to transition from state to state. And we'll do this with Django FSM. So the Django Finite State Machine add-on or application, which you can install. So it's basically a reusable framework that gets everyone mentally aligned to work on your project. This is especially important if you've got multiple developers on the project. And instead of coming up with conventions for how you're going to treat, say, Boolean fields or maybe an enumeration field for what state an item is going to be in, this framework sets up an opinionated way of doing that. Again, Django being the framework that it is, Django is fairly opinionated about like what ORM you're going to use, typically what templating you're going to use, how you're going to write your models, and those kinds of things. Django FSM provides yet another avenue or opinionated way to do these finite state machines or workflows in Django, so that everyone else who's on the team will know, oh, we're using Django FSM. I know how to do that. I know that I should make a field like this with these various transitions, and now we know how to all manage the state of our content together. So to get started, it is on GitHub. So you can just go to the Django FSM repository. Well, let's talk about this. I love this this module for Django because it is a simple approach to a fairly complicated problem. If you remember back to the couple diagrams that were, a bazillion, circles with lots of arrows going between them, how are we going to actually manage all that complexity in a way that's easy for us all to understand? So the basics of using Django FSM really come down to these three areas. The custom model field. So on your models, as you're creating fields, you may make a workflow state field on it and use the FSM field. That allows you to specify what the names of the states are, enumerations for them. A specific Python decorator that you'll apply to methods on your models. And then there's going to be bonus methods or model methods that are added to your model from FSM via the contribute to class. It's actually a really neat usage of the contribute to class here. But basically, when you decorate your methods on your models with the Django FSM decorators in that field, this will add some very specific methods that you don't see in your code, but will be callable on your model to help you do things like find out what transitions are available and what states are available to go to. So if we look at an example of an FSM field, we can see here we have workflow state. So the last field on this specific slide for the case report specifies an FSM field with a set of choices, an initial default, and then some help text like you would normally expect in a Django model field. And if we look at the workflow state object, so you can see this has got a workflow state class that it's getting the constant for choices and initial state off of. We can set up our workflow state to have a choices attribute, which is just a tuple of tuples that'll have the kind of plain text, human readable version of that, and then whatever gets saved into the database. Well, actually, it's the other way around. The saved in the database, and then the human readable version of that. So it puts it into title case. So when you look at draft, it'll be a draft with a capital D. And then we have our initial state. So we can encapsulate all the workflow states, initial states, and choices into its own section of the code that's not muddying up or cluttering our specific models, because we may actually want to reuse this across multiple models inside of our actual application. So how do we use these states? Well, the main way we use them is with via transitions. And it's really important to understand that you don't want to change the values on those workflow state fields manually. I mean, you could go in and actually actuate your model and say, set a specific field, workflow state equals draft or workflow state equals published. But technically, you risk kind of messing up the flow of the state because we control where things can come from and where things can go to by using the transitions. So if we decorate, for example, this edit method, which actually just has a pass on it right now, we can say this transition is going to be affecting a specific field, in our case, workflow state. This is only going to show up or be available to items that are in a draft state. So if the item's in draft, I can see the edit transition. You can control who can edit by the permission. So that's just a callable on your object to determine whether the person is like the author or the editor. And then a target state that workflow should end in. In our case, we're merely using edit, and you'll understand this later, to provide an audit log of when changes were made to a specific content object inside the site. So that's why there's actually no implementation to the edit transition other than just pass to make it happy for Python itself. There's a little more in detail version of a transition that shows an example of performing some actions actually when a transition happens. So moving an item from state to state to state is all fine and good. But what's actually even more interesting is if you can actually move an item from state to a state and during that transition have something happen. Like for example, sending an email. In this case, we're going to go from some number of states. So there's an approve transition that is available for author review. If you have the permission to submit, if that returns true, then you would see this transition available to you, and the target state being author review, or I'm sorry, admin review. We're going from author review to admin review. So the approval transition now will look at, set a couple flags, maybe on your content, whether the author has approved it and the admin's approved it, and then actually go ahead and send an email as like a notification mechanism for your piece of content. So those permissions I mentioned are also methods that you'll just put on your existing model. And in this case, if we're looking to see if a person can edit or not, we'll just evaluate, say, who the current user is, see if the current workflow state makes sense with, can edit. So in our case, we had two different edit actions or edit transitions, but they're really using the same permission. There's the same transition, but using different permissions based on whether the author was submitting it for edit or whether the reviewer was submitting it for edit. In this case, we want to catch both of those cases, which is like the first case here for workflow state, whether it's a draft, retracted, or author review, then the person, if the user email matches the primary author email, will say it's true and you can edit. If the workflow state is an admin review and the user is staff, then we also return true so that that transition is available. Otherwise, just return false. So that's how these permissions work with the Django Finite State Machine to allow you to control access to the various transitions, which in turn controls who could move something along in a workflow specifically. This is another example. I want to point something out in this specific example. For the can submit, you'll see that we're getting current user, but we're getting it from a current user middleware. And there's actually a workaround here that's happening. Sometimes it's unreliable to get the current user out of the request because maybe this is being run from a management command or a celery task or some other out of band process where you may not know who the current user actually is who submitted this. So by using a middleware, we can ensure we can grab the specific user out. And there's actually a workaround. I put a link at the end for another Django app you can add into your application to get this implementation of current user middleware. Now, some convenience. I mentioned earlier that the application itself uses contribute to class to give you some fields automatically, or not fields, but some methods automatically on your model. For example, enumerating over all the declared transitions. So if you actually wanted to get all the transitions for workflow state, you would call get all workflow understate transitions on your model, and it'll give you a list of private, publish, all the various states that were in our workflow state specific class. Same thing holds true for getting all the transitions. This will actually enumerate over all the decorated methods that have transition on them and return a list of all the available possible transitions. Then the last one's probably the most interesting one is getting available user transitions. So if we get all the available user transitions, this takes into consideration the permissions field on whether you have the ability to do that or not. So if you're building up a UI that has maybe a kind of a wizard or actions associated to the various content pieces you got in your database, you can use get available user transitions to populate those buttons to make sure that they always show the correct transitions at the correct time for the correct user. Now, another nice bit is in addition to doing operations inside of the transition, like I showed sending an email during a transition from one piece of content to another workflow state, you can also, there are signals from Django FSM that allow you to hook into pre-transition and post-transition. So you may want to do pre-transition checks, for example, to ensure something can happen or something's in the right state. And if you do that, you can now have better control over maybe firing off or creating some kind of prerequisite content that needs to be in place, or post-transition is on success. do these other additional actions that are maybe not necessarily related to that specific piece of content, but are maybe shared across multiple kinds of content in the site that are all sharing a set of workflow states and listening for these specific kinds of signals. Now, when you call these signals, they get passed in the sender, which is the model class itself, and the instance, so a specific instance of that model that you're acting on, what transition name was called, what the source, and what the target workflow states are. So a lot of information for you to actually make decisions on where to send your content or how to deal with specific situations. So here's an example of hooking up a post-transition email send for the case reports. So we've got our FSM signals for post-transition. We're connecting this specific method here to our case report sender. And then we do all the processing checks and then whatever, double check that we're going from a specific state to another state and logging or handling whatever specific side cases we wanted to. So I mentioned again, using that current user middleware. If you want to be able to get that reliably, check out this package called Django-CRUM, so current user middleware. That will help you determine whether, in most cases, if you've got an actual user and who's doing it. Again, this is for things like a management command or a cron job. But now we can use this middleware to be able to get the user reliably in out of band type situations. For example, pre and post transitions, the signals I just showed, they don't include the who, like a user associated to them. So you would want to be able to use that middleware to grab out the current user because it's not actually passed along to you as that happens. All right, and this last bit of example here is showing off using the current user middleware for getting the user. We're inside of a specific transition, and it's just showing using that current user again to do that. So now we're getting a little more complicated. If you've got multiple users accessing your system simultaneously and possibly acting on the same object in your database, you're going to want to make sure that you don't end up with race conditions. And so for guaranteed protection against race conditions caused by concurrently running or concurrently executed transitions, you want to make sure you use the optimistic locking and this concurrent transition mix-in, which will actually help. Basically, your transitions don't have to have any side effects except for changes in the database. And you always want to run save method after, or save method on the object within the, the DB atomic block. So this helps make sure that if someone had started a transition and someone else starts a transition, it will detect that and give you an exception that you can actually handle appropriately. Now, some nice little add-ons to Django FSM. If you want to add an audit log for every transition that happens inside your site, this is super handy because you want to know who did what, when, and maybe even why. But this allows you to add a decorator in addition to the transition called FSM log by, and without any other things other than adding the Django FSM log application to your Django project, adding that transition decorator, you will now get a table that shows who, when, and what objects. It's basically a nice little audit log of who's changed things. You may have to do a little more work on the other side if you want to be able to detect changes inside the content. But at least with this in place, you'll have a minimal set of audit logs to know who did what. And it doesn't stop there. If you actually want to be able to use Django FSM in the Django admin, you can actually add in Django FSM admin, and this will now give you buttons inside the Django admin so that you can transition content from one state to another without modifying the field directly, which I mentioned you want to avoid. You really want to be able to enforce that the FSM field value can only be manipulated by a transition, which you can do. There's a specific setting you can set in your Django settings file that will enforce that FSM fields only be modified via transitions and never modified directly. Make sure there's no questions here. I don't think there are. Oh, my audio is back. I think we're good. So here's an example of adding the FSM transition mixin into your admin. And once you do this, the admin will now have additional buttons to send you along the transitions. Okay. And like I said, you want to be able to enforce that and take a finite state machine first strategy. And this is all about, again, developer mindset. We want to ensure that folks are all using FSM together. So putting this into your configs for Django FSM will ensure that in the admin, you can't just manually change the content when you're looking at the edit page for your specific model. So that's how you do that. And another last little bonus, if you actually want to be able to produce those diagrams like I showed in the very beginning of the presentation, where you've got the nice little bubbles with what the various states are and the arrows going between them with all the like transition names, the Django FSM package comes with a management command called graph transitions, and you can pass it in your specific model and output it to a dot file. And then with that dot file, you can now produce a PNG file. So if you want to be able to view that image. The one thing you got to be careful of is if you have module not found graphiz, you may not have graphiz as part of your standard Django project. But if you add it as like a dev dependency, so it's only installed locally when you're building this, you can actually now produce beautiful images like this. So you can take that case report workflow, which was generated using a different system. This is the output directly from Django FSM. One of the things I really, really like about being able to use a Django FSM and having this kind of output, there's no better test of a business process or a logic in confirmation than going to the business user, showing them a picture, and saying, does this look like what you expect it to look like? And if I make a code change, did that code change generate a diagram that matches my expectations of how this workflow should be working in the end? So it's really powerful. I mean, obviously a picture is worth 1,000 words. In this case, it's actually going to maybe hopefully save you time or help you explain to folks who aren't necessarily technical how this all works. And with that, I will open it up to questions. So if anybody's got questions, they can feel free to put them into the Slido on the side. I'm also watching the track one in the Slack channel. I don't know if I should thank myself for being here. That's been really great. I really enjoyed it. Lots of fun. I'm super excited actually about being here at Python Web Conference. I'm excited we are putting this on and having all the web community come together in one spot. So unless there are any other questions, I will duck into the gallery room down below. So I will go join that here momentarily and see if anybody wants to ask me any kind of face-to-face questions. So otherwise, the next session up here in this track is going to be Rob McBroom talking to us about using cookie cutter for starting Django projects. And I know I love that topic, so I'm looking forward to seeing that one as well. Actually, so the question was, so are FSM like Signals Plus? I'm actually not familiar with Signals Plus, so maybe if we go into the gallery room, you can describe to me Signals Plus. So I'll see all of you over into the gallery. Oh, you know what? We've got one more thing I want to show you before we go. Up on the 6 Feet Up GitHub, there is a project called 60 Note, and it's basically a sample project that we did for a webinar with JetBrains Group. In that project, on the webinars branch, you can actually see a real usage of Django FSM. So if you're looking for an example, this allows us to put a workflow state onto a specific note. And so I've got an FSM field with a default draft, and then you can see these are the transitions taking us from draft to published and from published to draft. So there's a publish and there's a retract. In this case, I'm using it to send WebSockets to an application on the front end that's React, listening for workflow changes so that the UI on the front end can react to changes on the back end. So if one person changed the workflow state, another person's UI would reflect that in real time. So if you want to check out that example, go to GitHub /6feetup. There is a project there called 60 Note, and it includes a Webinar 2020 branch that shows off using asynchronous with Django FSM. Again, thank you very much. I will be in the gallery room here momentarily. And there we go. Stop share. There we go. All right. I'll see you all in a bit.